This is The Dispatch. Fellow dispatchers, Trump knew. And there are tapes. Oh, there are tapes, as Jim Comey famously prayed. Lordy, I hope there are tapes. But these tapes show what many of us have long believed and we now know on the record. Among the 18 or so taped interviews that Trump did with the journalist Bob Woodward for his forthcoming book called Rage, here's what Woodward's book reveals. Trump downplayed the threat of the novel coronavirus, and the results are nothing less than tragic. Nearly 200,000 Americans are dead as of this broadcast. And it's an election year, so it's never enough to underscore this point, dispatchers. You see, it really does matter who the president is. Pretty consistently, Trump is often compared to Richard Nixon. And though exact historical analogies are often facile, there are some overlaps for sure. Nixon was a man who experienced violent protests and demonstrations throughout most of his political career. Like Trump, though Nixon was the challenger and Trump is the incumbent, Nixon ran for president for the second time, actually, having been beaten by JFK 8 years before, in 1968 as the law and order candidate. And it was also a very tumultuous time. There were the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Senator Bobby Kennedy, and riots erupted everywhere, from cities including Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, Memphis, Washington, D.C., and other ones. Civil rights and anti-Vietnam War protests closed down campuses large and small, and there were nightly news reports of endless death from abroad. The killing fields of Vietnam, remember, were raging at this time, and bloody incidents like the Tet Offensive owned the headlines. But Nixon was also a man who, despite winning re-election with 49 states in 1972, that's right, 49 states, and despite the ongoing social unrest roiling America during most of his presidency, who was done in by his, tapes. Yeah, that's right. Though Nixon resigned before he could be impeached, the revelation that there was a taping system in the White House proved politically fatal for him. Nixon's resignation in August of 1974 was the culmination, of course, of the scandal forever known as Watergate. And much of the corruption in which Nixon and many of his chief aides engaged was uncovered by an intrepid team, you may remember, a duo of reporters at the Washington Post known as Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Watergate made a star out of both of them, but particularly Woodward, who ever since his newspaper days has become a sort of dean, a doyen, if you will, of the Washington media establishment, a ubiquitous figure whose prolific tell-all books on all things government have also made him a household name. President Trump acknowledged to the journalist Bob Woodward that he had knowingly played down the coronavirus earlier this year, even though he was aware it was quote-unquote deadly and vastly more serious than the seasonal flu. This is deadly stuff, Trump told Woodward on February 7th in one of a series of interviews he conducted with the president for the book Rage that's about to come out next week. You just breathe the air, and that's how it's passed, Trump said. And so that's a very tricky one, Trump continued. That's a very delicate one. It's also more deadly than even your strenuous flu. That was a vastly different story than Trump was telling the public. In early March, the president was suggesting on Twitter that the virus was less deadly than the flu. You've probably heard that a lot during this. On March 9th of this year, Trump tweeted this. So, last year, 37,000 Americans died from the common flu. It averages between 27,000 and 70,000 per year. Nothing is shut down. Life and the economy go on. At this moment, there are 546 confirmed cases of coronavirus with 22 deaths. Think about that. It's always a tweet. That was the tweet. I always wanted to play it down, Trump also told Bob Woodward on March 19th of this year. I still like playing it down because I don't want to create a panic. Mr. Biden's going to destroy the suburbs. I don't want to create a panic. Anyway, Woodward's recording makes it clear that the president was not simply misinformed or being wishful about the virus, but deliberately lying about what he knew. As this country got off to a slow and disastrous response to the virus, Trump would say the pandemic, quote unquote, came out of nowhere, and that the danger could not have been foreseen. In fact, Trump was specifically aware of the threat and chose to misinform the public about it. Many people don't know this, but the Nixon tapes, which everybody often refers to, were revealed actually by a guy very few people knew. On July 13th, 1973, a White House Deputy Chief of Staff named Alexander Butterfield told Senate investigators that Nixon had a taping system. It wasn't known then just how damning the tapes would be, but they would prove that Nixon had tried to cover up the burglary at the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, hence the scandal named Watergate, on June 17, 1972. As White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Butterfield managed the president's West Wing schedule. So he knew that in February 1971, about a year and a half before the burglary, a voice-activated taping system was installed in the Oval Office and other areas because Butterfield himself ordered the Secret Service to put it in. Only a handful of people knew of its existence. And if not for Butterfield's revelation, the system might have stayed secret. Nixon fought as hard as he legally could to hold on to these tapes. He even ignored suggestions that he burned them. Nixon's lawyers argued it before the Supreme Court. The tapes were protected by executive privilege. And on July 24, 1974, well, the justices decided differently. By a vote of 8-0, because then Justice William Rehnquist recused himself, Nixon was ordered to turn over the tapes. 15 days later, Richard Milhous Nixon resigned the presidency in disgrace. If you didn't have the tapes, then there would have been an ambiguity about all this. Funnily enough, Bob Woodward told a conference this back in 2012. He said it's the clarity of the tapes. The people who listened to them, particularly Republicans in the House Judiciary Committee, would not only deal with the substance, but it was the rage that Nixon would get in about small things and the indifference to the law, end quote. As I've said, no two historical instances are ever the same, but to remind you of a quote I use and have used on this program, which is attributed without corroboration to Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And yet, unlike Nixon, Trump became the third president to be impeached last year, though he was later acquitted by the Senate, like Bill Clinton and Andrew Johnson before him. And there's always been talk of tapes throughout Trump's chaotic, scandal-plagued presidency. And if we could have only had access to them, Trump's seemingly Teflon-coated streak of good fortune would, well, finally reverse itself and stick fatally and damagingly like Velcro. Here they are. Wasn't on Russia, wasn't on the Ukraine, but it was on COVID. Recorded by that fearless sleuth, Bob Woodward, whose crackerjack, gumshoe-style journalism is long credited with catalyzing the downfall of another president, Richard Nixon. I, for one, can't say whether history repeats or rhymes, but history, I believe, will remember these Woodward tapes as being as significant as the Nixon tapes. We've all become habituated to one political disaster, even cataclysmic disasters, after the other. But history's perspective will no doubt be damning. And though we don't yet know history's verdict, I will err on the side that Trump shouldering the blame for at the very least 200,000 deaths, knowing that he could have prevented it, will be its own discordant and deeply haunting rhyme all its own. I'm Adam Epstein, and this is The Dispatch.